Welcome back. It's the morning of September 8th, 1900, and Galveston, Texas, is waking up exactly the way it always does. Streetcars rattle down Broadway past three-story mansions with wraparound porches. Fishermen haul in nets along the wharf. Children run barefoot toward the beach, where the surf is unusually high but nobody seems worried. Galveston is the richest city in Texas. Some say the richest per capita in the entire country. And this Saturday feels like any other. Trade ships loading cotton for Liverpool, bankers walking to work in linen suits, the smell of salt water and fresh bread drifting through the streets. Nobody in this city of nearly 40,000 people knows that within 24 hours, most of what they can see around them will be gone. Using AI reconstructions, restored photographs, and painted records from the period, we're going to walk through this island as it was. Through its rise, its splendor, its people, and the single day that changed Texas forever. And by the end, you'll see exactly how these same streets, these same buildings look today. But to understand what Galveston became, you have to go back much further than 1,900 back before Texas was Texas at all. Long before European ships ever reached this coastline, the land was home to the Caddo in the east, with their farming villages and earthen mounds, the Karankawa along the Gulf Shore, who fished and hunted the barrier islands, and further west and north, the Apache and later the Comanche, whose mastery of the horse would eventually make them one of the most formidable powers on the continent. These were not simple or static societies. The Caddo built structured trade networks stretching hundreds of miles inland. By the final decades of the 19th century, that unimaginable future had arrived. Galveston had become the busiest port in Texas and one of the busiest in the entire United States, moving more cotton through its wharves than almost anywhere else on Earth. Ships from New York, Liverpool, and Hamburg lined up in the harbor. The Strand, the city's main commercial street, was nicknamed the Wall Street of the South, lined with cast-iron facades and five-story buildings that housed banks, insurance companies, and trading houses. Broadway Avenue was a showcase of Gilded Age wealth, with Victorian mansions built from imported marble, stained glass, and hand-carved woodwork. The city had opera houses, electric trolleys, and one of the first telephone systems in the state. And yet, for all its polish, Galveston in 1900 was still very much a place under construction. New hotels were going up along the beachfront. City engineers were arguing over whether the island needed a seawall, a proposal some considered too expensive and unnecessary for a place that had weathered storms before. That debate, still unresolved on the morning of September 8th, would turn out to be the most consequential unfinished business in Texas history. Civic and spiritual life on the island reflected its mixed heritage. Grand churches, Catholic cathedrals built by descendants of Spanish and Mexican settlers, Protestant congregations established by New England merchants, and synagogues built by Jewish immigrant families all stood within blocks of each other. The county courthouse anchored the legal life of the city, while the U.S. Custom House, a striking building of iron and stone, oversaw the enormous flow of trade moving in and out of the harbor. Galveston's elite gathered in private clubs to broker deals that shaped commerce across the entire state, while immigrant dockworkers, freed black Texans, German and Italian laborers, and Mexican families filled the neighborhoods just blocks away, each community layering its own traditions, food, and faith onto the island's identity. Walk the streets of Galveston on an ordinary day in 1900 and you would have felt the crowd before you saw it. Roughly 37,000 people called the island home, packed onto a strip of land barely 2 miles wide at its broadest point and rising only about 9 feet above sea level at its highest natural elevation. Vendors sold fresh shrimp and oysters pulled straight from the bay that morning. Cotton bales stacked along the wharves gave the air a dusty, fibrous smell, mixed with brine from the Gulf and coal smoke from the rail yards. Streetcar bells clanged. Longshoremen shouted cargo counts in English, Spanish, and German. Children played in alleys behind grand hotels while their parents worked as maids, clerks, or dockhands. The wealthy rode in private carriages past newsboys hawking the Galveston Daily News. It was a city of sharp contrasts. Immense fortunes built one block from crowded boarding houses, but it moved with the confident, restless energy of a place that believed its best days were still ahead of it. For leisure, nothing rivaled the Galveston beachfront itself. Elaborate wooden bathhouses stretched out over the Gulf on pilings, some capable of holding thousands of bathers at once, with dance halls, restaurants, and diving platforms built directly over the water. The Olympia and the Pagoda Bathhouse were local landmarks, drawing visitors from across Texas who came by rail specifically to swim in the Gulf and stroll the famous beach promenade. On summer weekends, these pavilions rang with music and laughter late into the evening, a symbol of a city that had built its identity as much around pleasure and reinvention as around commerce. It was, in a very real sense, the community's front porch, the place where every class of Galveston resident crossed paths. If the bathhouses were Galveston's public face, Broadway Avenue was its private one. Nowhere was that more visible than in the mansions built by the island's shipping and banking families. Homes filled with imported European art, hand-laid tile, and hardwood salvaged from across the globe. These houses were monuments to a fortune built on cotton, insurance, and trade, each one more ornate than the last, competing quietly for status through turrets, stained glass, and manicured gardens. And yet, whatever comfort those walls promised, whatever distance money seemed to buy from hardship, none of it would matter in the face of what was already moving across the Gulf of Mexico. Wealth had built taller houses, but it had not built a seawall. The storm had been building for days, tracked loosely as it crossed the Caribbean and entered the Gulf of Mexico, but forecasting technology in 1900 was primitive, and warnings from the U.S. Weather Bureau significantly underestimated its strength. By the morning of September 8th, waves were already washing unusually far up the beach, and a strange, heavy swell rolled in from the southeast even though the sky remained mostly clear. Many residents, having weathered smaller storms before, assumed this would be much the same. By early afternoon, water was rising through the streets. By evening, sustained winds are estimated to have reached 145 miles per hour, placing it at Category 4 strength, and a storm surge of roughly 15 feet swept across an island that stood barely 9 feet above sea level at its highest point. There was, in effect, nowhere to go. Streets became rivers, then seas. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to splinters within hours, some literally scraped from their foundations. Survivors later described debris fields, entire blocks of wreckage pushed inland by the surge, acting almost like a battering ram against the structures still standing behind them. The aftermath was staggering in scale. Entire neighborhoods had simply ceased to exist, and rescue workers described a landscape that seemed unrecognizable from the city that had stood there only a day before. Relief efforts poured in from across the country, and the newly organized American Red Cross under Clara Barton conducted one of its largest disaster responses to date. Yet even amid the devastation, Galveston's leaders made a defiant choice. Rather than abandon the island, they resolved to rebuild it, and to do so in a way that would prevent such a catastrophe from ever repeating. In the years that followed, engineers undertook one of the most extraordinary infrastructure projects in American history, constructing a massive concrete seawall along the Gulf-facing shoreline and then, astonishingly, raising the grade of the entire city itself, in some places by more than 8 feet, pumping in sand beneath buildings that were jacked up and left standing while the ground rose slowly around them. Modern engineers and historians who study the Galveston seawall still marvel at its scale and ambition for the era, a direct, physical response to catastrophe that reshaped the very geography of the island. Restoration efforts throughout the 20th century preserved much of the historic Strand District and the surviving Broadway mansions, allowing later generations to walk through buildings that had somehow withstood both the storm and a century of Gulf weather afterward. What surprised many later researchers was not just how much had been destroyed, but how much of the city's spirit, its architecture, its layered communities, its stubborn refusal to disappear, had ultimately survived. It's worth pausing on what all of this really meant. Behind every statistic was a person walking to work that morning, a child playing near the beach, a family gathered for dinner that never came. These were not simply casualties of history. They were neighbors, merchants, laborers, and parents whose everyday lives were interrupted in a single night. Remembering them as people, not numbers, is the least this history owes them. Today, if you walk along Galveston's Strand District, many of those original cast-iron facades still stand, carefully restored and now home to shops, restaurants, and museums rather than cotton brokers. The seawall built after 1900 still runs for over 10 miles along the Gulf, and it remains in active use today, a monument that is also, quite literally, still doing its job. Several of the grand Broadway mansions, including the Bishop's Palace, survive and are open for public tours, their original stonework and stained glass still intact despite everything the island has weathered since. The bathhouses themselves are gone, but Galveston's beaches remain some of the most visited in the state, drawing families for the same reason they always have. And further inland, the broader story of Texas continues to be preserved across the state, from the missions of San Antonio to the Capitol grounds in Austin, each one a physical thread connecting the Texas of today to the centuries that shaped it. That's the story of Galveston, and in many ways, the story of Texas itself. A place built by ambition, tested by disaster, and rebuilt by sheer refusal to be erased. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. If there's a place in Texas history or anywhere else you'd like to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments below. I genuinely read through them for ideas. See you in the next one.